Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Social Europe videocast. My name is Robin Wilson, and our distinguished guest today is Eunice Goes, Professor of Politics at Richmond, American University of London, and author of Social Democracy, a just published historical survey of the social democratic political tradition in Europe, from its origins to its contemporary dilemmas. Hello, Eunice, and welcome.
Well, hello, Robin. Thank you very much for having me and giving me space to talk about my book.
My pleasure. Your book is a sobering account of social democracy since its emergence, charting a steadily diminishing political ambition, a fading of the red flag, if you like, over time. In your telling, in the latter 19th century, social democracy forsook the ill-defined revolution of Marx and Engels for a parliamentary road to socialism. In the early 20th century, it demarcated itself from purportedly radical yet authoritarian alternatives. In the later 20th century, it accommodated to neoliberal capitalism, and in this century, it became disorientated by what people have called the polycrisis. Why do you think there was this steady trajectory, Eunice, rather than more back and forth, more moments of social democratic achievement to record, such as the universal welfare states established in the Nordic countries in the middle of the last century?
Well, I think there was the result of different things operating at the same time, and the there was a bit of backwards and forwards, so it was not so steady. There was always a little bit of an element of contingency in reacting to events as they emerged. But I think the first thing, the first factor that drove this social democratic backsliding, if we can talk about it in those terms, it has to do with, it's the contact when theory gets in contact with the mass reality of politics. And this is something that we all experience in our lives. We read, for instance, parenting. It's one of those things. We read before we parents. We read about, how to look after children. And then once our children is presented before us, we are faced with completely new sets of situations, and we have to kind of to improvise. And I think that was the first situations that the theorists in the late 19th century, that's what we had, the theories of social democracy. One thing was the theory of social democracy, so their imagination, the way that they imagined a socialist society. And then they got on to start to implement that social democratic society, but reality is always different from the theory. And so there had to be quite a lot of adaptation. And the first adaptation had to do with adapting to the electoral territory, the electoral ground in which they were going to bring their vision to fruition. They very quickly saw, and Marx and Engels were the first ones to argue that, well, parliamentary democracy and universal suffrage offer them an incredible tool to bring that vision of society about. But how they imagined their electorate, and in particular the working class or the supporters of the labor movement, was quite different from the voters that they encountered on the ground. And so if the road to power was through elections, was through the parliamentary road, they had to adapt to these new voters. And these voters were not, they might have been quite sympathetic to the cause of social democracy. It might have been, very supportive, but they were not militants, and they were not dogmatic followers of theory. And so if parties wanted to win elections, they needed to adjust to that kind of reality. They also had to adjust to the fact that in many countries, the industrial working class was not a majority. So if they wanted to be in power and to start to transform society, they needed to make proposals that offered something to those other voters. And so out of this adapting and dealing with reality as it was on the ground, adapting to this electorate as well, they had to change. So they had to adapt their political and electoral strategies to the situations they encountered on the ground. Finally, I think the trajectory of social democracy was also one of struggle. So they had to deal with a fairly hostile environment. And it was not just the difficulty of winning elections, it was the difficulty of dealing with a series of institutions in the societies in which they were operating that were quite hostile to a socialist project. So from judicial systems, the law, the media, of course, mostly privately owned, and of course quite hostile to a socialist enterprise. So socialists had to kind of to fight. They had to kind of to deal and adapt to those situations. And of course, many of those choices were done in terms of how they interpret the grounds that they encountered, and also the things that they needed to prioritize when faced those circumstances. So in a sense, this history is over 160 years of history, has been one of struggle, and one where social democratic parties, with the exception of Scandinavia, have been mostly in opposition. They very few times have social democratic parties governed in their countries in which they are operating.
One of the most interesting things about your book, Eunice, is the way you recast the split with what became the Third International, the communist tradition, because you do stress that both Marx and Engels favored universal suffrage and a democratic republic as the ideal form of government. And as you point out, how Lenin was actually quite disdainful of the working class and was much in favor of substituting the party for the actually existing working class in all its variety and complexity, as you say. But couldn't your view a different path have been taken at any time which would have won public consent to the political goals of social democracy rather than these being diluted to secure electoral victories? I'm thinking perhaps particularly after the Second World War with the discrediting of fascism and the so-called free market, which provided a Polanyian moment in which the liberal ideas of Keynes and Beveridge could thrive. In that context, could social democrats have done more to change the political weather rather than bend with the wind? Or do you think that the electoral incentives to become catch-all Volksparteien and the constraints of economic orthodoxy underpinning the governance arrangements of what became the European Union were just too strong?
Well, they could have always chosen a different path. And I think one of the things that I try to say in this book is that social democratic parties and social democracy as an ideology was not solely at the mercy of events. And this evolution was not just a reaction to the events which they encountered on the ground. So it was not, the process of dilution was not just the result of, well, the world is much more different than we had imagined, so we had to kind of to accommodate to the world as it is in order to bring just slight improvements. I think they could have made other choices because in the end, social democratic parties, and in fact, any political agent has options, and there are always other options. They could have done more. And so many of the choices, they were essentially the result of the way in which social democratic parties, their leaders, and so on, the way that they interpreted the situations in which they found themselves in, and the way that they prioritize as well their social democratic agendas. And I think this is perhaps if there is a message of hope for social democracy as an ideology, is the rediscovery of this political agency. So the capacity to make a different choice and to follow a different path from the one that they've encountered. Now, you mentioned in the post-war period that perhaps they could have done something else. Well, the post-war period was actually very challenging for social democracy because, with the exception of Britain right after the Second World War, who was essentially won a landslide victory, but very shortly was in opposition after. And with the exception of Scandinavian countries, social democratic parties were in opposition for until what? The late 1960s, 1970s. And very often they tended to come to power at the moments of big crisis of capitalism. So they were very challenging periods and very challenging times to be in power. They've also, in that post-war period, they were also struggling in an environment in which the center-right parties were making very similar proposals to the ones of social democracy. And so the post-war consensus that is very often mentioned as a social democratic consensus, that social democratic consensus was in reality a liberal Christian Democrat Cold War consensus that saw, and we saw that with the United States, who saw that they needed to demonstrate to the citizens of Europe that capitalism was a viable economic system and political system that would deliver well-being, general well-being to everyone else. So the kind of social and economic policies that were implemented in that era, they were extremely congenial to social democratic ideas. They were not necessarily invented by social democrats. They were they were the result of a dialogue between different traditions, and perhaps it is from this dialogue between different progressive traditions that sometimes you can have you can find or rediscover that social democratic path that will lead to a renewal of the tradition. In the 1970s, curiously, and I think this is perhaps one of the most interesting periods in social democracy. So this was a period of great economic instability. This was essentially the period of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, the collapse of Keynesianism too. But there was a moment where you had a whole range of social democratic leaders, so Willy Brandt in Germany, Bruno Kreisky in Austria, Olof Palme in Sweden, but also a whole range of politicians working in the European Commission and the socialist parliamentarians in the European Parliament, in the European Union, who were trying to carve out a different route, a different road to Europe. And they were doing it in a way that was not naive. They were essentially seeing what was happening in terms of global trade. And so they felt, well, if social democracy is going to survive, we need essentially to prepare workers and citizens to this movement. So the only way for social democrats to offer a kind of a countervailing power to the power of capital is through economic democracy. So by empowering workers, by ensuring that workers have a say in the way that they work and in the way that economies are governed. So the corporate, they are involved in corporate governance. And this agenda was pursued with great seriousness by the social democratic leaders. But then there was a change of leadership and yet again, decisions were taken that accepted that the Keynesian consensus was over and that now the only way to go was through fiscal orthodoxy. We had James Callaghan in the United Kingdom saying that Keynesianism had run its course. And crucially, in Germany, Helmut Schmidt replaced Willy Brandt, Helmut Schmidt, who imposed a kind of an order-liberal path to Europe. And that was an extremely consequential decision. And then throughout the 80s and 90s, social democratic parties across Europe, across the whole European continent, they pretty much accepted this path. And they thought that they could achieve social democratic goals through the free market, by creating something called the knowledge economy, whereby workers will be equipped with skills and they would be able to fight the competitive market. But in the meantime, all the social democratic ideas and policies that could have contributed to the emancipation of workers and voters in general, they were somehow abandoned, because what we've seen, especially in the 21st century, has been the rise of insecure work, of precarity, of inequality. So to a large extent, we are back to the same level of inequality and unbridled capitalism, which Marx and Engels described, in which the social democratic parties of the 19th century try to come up with a project that would diminish their power.
In the book, you challenge the idea that only a so-called third way option for social democracy, as you've just referred to, Eunice, was, or indeed is, viable electorally. You've pointed to the evidence from research supported by the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which shows that votes lost by social democratic parties in recent years have largely gone to more radical parties on the left and to the Greens, not, as some thought, to the resurgent populist right. Yet you do not support as an alternative a left populism, as advocated by Ernesto Leclerc and Chantal Mouffe. So what would you say is your broad platform that you think Social Democrats should advocate on issues such as inequality or economic democracy, if they're not simply to muddle through, as you suggest they shouldn't, but are to reinvest in goals and values as you suggest they should?
Well, I think there's been an emerging agenda since the global financial crisis, and an emerging agenda that focuses on inequality, and to a certain extent is almost like going back to basics, because the socialist project is a project of human emancipation. So the purpose is to create a society where human beings, workers, are free to pursue the lives that they want, but it is a life living communally. Human beings are mostly social. And the idea was, well, the greatest obstacle to the emancipation of human beings is capitalism. That was essentially diagnostics of Marx and Engels. So that is why the pursuit of the socialist dream was always had as a condition the destruction of capitalism. Well, very quickly, social democrats realized that that was not possible, but they tamed it, they tried to tame it, and they believed that capitalism was also highly adaptable. That was some of the conclusions that they reached at the beginning of the 20th century, and to a large extent, that was that tamed capitalism that delivered the 30 years of social mobility, economic growth, and so on. So we have got again to a moment where we had rising inequality, rising insecurity that is felt in a variety of ways in all areas of life. And so social democrats, they've realized, many of them realized, that they've conceded too much to the market. They've conceded too much power to the market, and that they need to rediscover a different role for the state. And so it will be around those lines that social democrats can try to carve out a new agenda. The left-wing populism, it is an interesting phenomenon because it is so different from social democracy, not only because of the different project that it assumes, but it is also because it is predicated on an idea of charismatic leadership, which is not necessarily democratic. And so I think the future path for social democracy, if social democrats are keen on keeping this tradition alive, I think it lies in focusing on deepening democracy at all levels. So politically, economically, and socially. So a greater involvement of citizens in public life, but also focusing on that economic democracy in order to deliver that emancipation. So freeing people to pursue other things in life other than just work. Work should be creative, but people should also be free to pursue other things, to have different roles in their own communities, to spend times with their families, to create works of art, to be creative in their own lives. That was essentially the socialist aspiration, which I think still has a lot of resonance. It is an ideal to which many people can aspire to. And so that agenda can be pursued. And the other thing that I would contribute to the renewal of that agenda is also an understanding of how focusing on trying to change political debate, trying to change the political narratives by fostering different forms of communication, perhaps thinking of different ways of dealing with the mainstream media, which have been so hostile to the social democratic project. Without that will, that's again the whole issue around agency, without that will to pursue a different conversation where you're making different arguments, there is no way that social democracy can survive another, I think, 160 years.
I want to home in on the social democratic parties themselves, Eunice, because you concur with Peter Mayer's thesis that they, though not only they, have over decades become, as he puts it, hollowed out by the atrophy of organic relationships to what in French they would call the popular classes, moving into a mediatized world of competition with rival elites for insertion into government. Inasmuch as social democratic parties have been renewed since the 1960s, a major factor has been social movements which have extended the social democratic focus on workers' rights, to which you just referred, to the rights of citizens more broadly, including to gender equality, sexual freedom, and above all, to a livable planet, part of that broader philosophy of emancipation you talk about. And I wonder whether the public sphere of civil society organizations, including reviving trade unions, might, in your view, provide more refreshment and renewal for social democratic parties today?
Oh, they do. They do. The civil society, and in particular trade unions, they do provide a very strong anchoring into social democratic parties. We saw that, for instance, with the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, where the disappearance of trade unions from people's lives, the disappearance of trade unions from certain communities, they've hollowed out entire communities. And what prevailed was an individualistic culture where essentially people believed that they were on their own, and they needed to adopt that kind of dog-eat-dog type of mentality, that competitive mentality, in order to survive, not even thrive, but survive in contemporary situations. Because we forget that trade unions, they are not just very useful organizations to ensure that workers are paid adequate wages and now working in correct and just conditions. But trade unions also offer a culture, an anchorage, activities. They've politicized the working class, and it's very interesting to see that people, workers at the beginning of the 20th century, with, were barely literate, had very few years of scholarization, who were extremely politicized. And that had been the role of trade unions, to politicize an entire class. What we've seen in the last, 4 decades or so, it's been a depoliticization, not only of the working class, but of voters in general. I encounter so many university students, university graduates, who are not politicized at all, because they are also not involved in political organizations and trade unions who offer them a way of understanding the world. And without having those civil society organizations that can mediate the relationship of citizens with the state, that can offer them a sense that they are not alone, because that's essentially what the labor movement brought. Workers were able to participate in those big marches, to fight for universal suffrage and many other very important political campaigns, because they felt that they were not alone. There was solidarity, and throughout solidarity, to the links of solidarity, they were able to be that countervailing force to the market. Neoliberals understood that very well in the 1980s. They knew that the only way to weaken and destroy the Keynesian project was by weakening trade unions. And they were very successful in the pursuit of that goal of weakening trade unions. So a return to a revival that social democratic parties will need to include very strongly trade unions. And interestingly, trade unions are also changing. They are much more feminized. They are also much more ethnically diverse, because the workforce have also changed. I think United Kingdom, the number of trade unions that are now led by women is very, very large. And we see that in other European countries. And this is a very good sign, because, well, all trade unions, they were not always the defenders of progressive values. They were often against gender equality. They were often against allowing workers from ethnic minorities to access certain jobs and so on. That all of that has changed. So trade unions have modernized, and they can become a really important agents and standard bearers of the social democratic parties.
Yes, we had a very interesting article, Eunice in Social Europe, some time ago by the woman who's now head of IG Metall, the German union that obviously is mainly male-dominated trade union, but she's now in the leadership and wrote a very interesting piece about that feminization of trade unions phenomenon you talk about. I remember when I was working in the then British Leyland car factory in Birmingham in the 1970s, which was nationalised, employed thousands and thousands of workers. The convener of the shop stewards was called Brian Robinson, and he was nicknamed Red Robbo. He remembered the Communist Party, and he famously described feminism as fanny politics, which would not be done now. At the same time in Birmingham, Arthur Scargill addressed a May Day rally with Tony Benn, and my then girlfriend joined others who protested against him because he was in the pages of the Yorkshire Miner, the newspaper that he had as part of his section of the NUM, National Union of Mine Workers. They had page 3 photographs of women who were topless, like in the Sun newspaper, the tabloid. And so a number of people protested at this May Day rally in Birmingham about Scargill's presence, and he just blew kisses at the women and went off the stage. Those things wouldn't happen in the trade unions in Britain, certainly today. Like Donald Sassoon's history of social democracy, Eunice, you identify the political tradition with the party seeking to advance it. Yet, given there's now a much more pluralist, liberal left than in the past, with social democratic parties not monopolizing progressive wisdom, how, in your view, should they cope with this environment, which is unlikely to go away? How can they relate to parties which are both rivals for progressive support and potential governing coalition partners, as in some of the most successful progressive administrations in recent years, like the red-green cases in Portugal and earlier in Norway? Or will, on the other hand, other parties simply occupy the social democratic space, which is a scenario you suggest might be possible, as in the way that Syriza has taken over from PASOK in Greece?
Well, that's a really it's a really tricky question. Now, in the 19th century, actually, the social democratic movement was very, very plural because across Europe there were other intellectual traditions that contributed to the success of social democracy. In Britain, for instance, liberalism was an ally of the movement in the mid 19th century. In France, republicanism and secular voices were extremely important too. In Spain, anarchism was extremely anarchist movements and so on, and were extremely important too, and very influential for the evolution of social democracy. So that plurality was somehow there, but of course the left likes to have a lot of fights amongst themselves, so that has also been a problem. So that is why it is quite difficult. I think the idea of alliances with other or dialogues with other left-wing forces, I think this is the way forward, especially because party systems and electorates are highly fragmented. We are dealing now with much more polarized societies. We are dealing with many more political parties also competing for elections. And I think to a certain extent that competition is healthy. It is the sign of a healthy polity. So, and I think the idea is to pursue competition and cooperation simultaneously. So in a sense, political parties should keep their identities and fight elections independently, because they're also pursuing different types of electorates. So in Germany, for instance, the SPD is mostly a voter supported by older voters. The younger voters tend to vote for other parties. It's the same in Portugal. The young voters are voting for either parties of the radical left or new parties of the center right, but not for the mainstream parties of this of the right or of the left. The Socialist Party in Portugal is mostly, the average voter is over 55. So there are different electorates that they need to pursue. But they should maintain a kind of a constructive dialogue that can then allow for the formation of a quasi-coalition agreement awesome form of understanding whenever they are close to form government. And interestingly, you mentioned Portugal. The socialists suffered a few weeks ago a very important electoral defeat. They've been in power since 2015, so 9 years in power. And the most stable and fruitful period of their government was when they were governing with the parties of the radical left. The other times where they had almost a majority of land, they lost the elections. They had to go to early elections. So I think there are some lessons to be learned there. I think the cases of Syriza and the cases also of what we're seeing in France, where the Socialist Party is practically inexistent. We have Jean-Luc Mélenchon dominating the discourse on the left, together with the Greens. The socialists are practically barely there. I think that shows what happens when socialist parties or social democratic parties are completely hollowed out. They went so much and they shifted so much into the right that their voters completely deserted them. So these are the lessons: dialogues, open dialogues, conversations with other progressive forces. This will keep socialist parties, social democratic parties, honest, intellectually and ideologically honest, so they can pursue, in one hand, they can say that they are competent, but at the same time principled. Because when they become obsessed with, budgetary surpluses, they are accountants and no longer the conveyors and the standard bearers of a tradition that wanted to emancipate workers.
Finally, Eunice, in today's globalized as well as individualized world, from equality to ecology, the goals of social democracy require multi-level governance to rein in corporate power, especially at the European and the global scales. Is social democracy capable of gearing itself up to that level and to making persuasive arguments that the collective action dilemmas the world faces make such global governance imperative? And can it win the argument for treaty changes in the EU, given the ways ordoliberalism is still embedded in a Europe crying out for public investment on an unprecedented scale, especially to effect a just green transition?
Well, I think they can. It's a question, do they want to? I think the capacity is there. Interestingly, in recent months, in conversations with socialist MPs and MEPs across Europe, one thing that struck me is that this younger generation, so those MPs and MEPs who are in their 30s, so we're talking about politicians who were politicized very strongly by the global financial crisis and the Eurozone crisis. They seem to be very ready to fight that fight. They seem to be very ready. They have an understanding of the world that seems to be very congenial to the social democratic project. They seem very concentrated and committed to reform capitalism. They've been working very hard to tackle the big problem of today, so labor insecurity, and they've been doing the necessary work in the European institutions. They're also fighting other causes like defending the right to abortion, like we saw in the last days in the European Union. So there's a whole new generation of European social democratic leaders and politicians who have that kind of understanding. And they also understand that those decisions are taken no longer only in the national arena, but in a multinational arena. That's essentially how politics happens, and social democracy in Europe will not be able to flourish without big changes in the European Union, and in particular, as you alluded to in your comment, within the Eurozone. Now, the circumstances are very hostile to that kind of social democratic project because the right dominates. And the European Parliament elections of June, well, the estimates are that parties of the radical right and of the far right are going to make big gains, and the Social Democrats are going to lose some seats in those elections. So that is going to make things even more difficult for those social democratic voices to make a different argument. Within the national governments of Europe, the scenarios are also not very optimistic. We see the SPD is extremely unpopular in Germany. The only socialist or social democratic bastion at the moment in Europe is Spain, because even in Scandinavia, the kind of social democracy that is practiced there is highly questionable, in particular in the areas of immigration and human rights. But we live in a highly volatile period. Politics is extremely volatile, and it is highly unlikely that promises to tackle immigration in a way that violates international conventions, and it is very inhumane. This is essentially the promises of the right. It's very unlikely that this is going to placate European voters across Europe. So in these volatile times, social democrats across Europe will have the possibility and they'll have the chance to bring and make different proposals and try to bring them to fruition. And perhaps they should lose the fear of losing the argument, because things are already very, very bad as they are. If they can make a different type of argument and show that the solutions that have been proposed by their rivals, they're not really delivering, well, maybe there is a time for that kind of comeback. I have some hope in this younger generation of social democratic MEPs and MPs.
And as Roosevelt famously said, in some similarly difficult times, Eunice, there's nothing to fear but fear itself. Many thanks, Eunice, for giving of your time and expertise there. That's been a fascinating discussion. You've been listening to Eunice Goes, Professor of Politics at Richmond American University of London and author of Social Democracy, published by Agenda Publishing. Thank you and goodbye.